Hello, welcome to today's Canary Media Forum, Building Climate Resilient Communities, Frontline Experiences, and Real World Solutions. I'm John Moon, where I lead sustainability for Wells Fargo. Today's webinar is part of the release of a book entitled What's Possible? Investing Now for Prosperous Sustainable Neighborhoods, which is a collection of essays from leaders within climate and community development fields. The project is a collaboration between the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC, Enterprise Community Partners, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where Wells Fargo is a proud sponsor for the project. What's Possible offers practical solutions for clean energy resilience and equity, and it's intended to be a playbook for taking collective action to build a stronger, more inclusive future. We're joined today by contributors of the book, as well as subject matter experts, where we'll discuss what it takes to build climate resilient communities, focusing especially on the perspectives of the frontline communities. We have an amazing panel, and I will do a brief introduction. So we have Annie Donovan, who's the president and CEO of Raza Development Fund. It's the largest Latino serving CDFI. And Annie's had previous leadership roles within the community development sector, including working at the White House, LISC, leading the CDFI Fund, and Capital Impact Partners, a CDFI. We're also joined by John Smith, Executive Director of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. John brings extensive experience in the nonprofit, government, education, and advocacy fields in his role at DSNI. He brings experience in economic development in the Walsh administration in Boston and other work in fair housing and youth. And finally, we have Brett Isaacs, who's a founder and Brett Isaac, founder and executive chairman of Navajo Power, a member of the Navajo Nation who's led numerous community development initiatives. Brett's company also has helped deploy over 200 off-grid solar projects to serve households without grid electricity. We have a Q&A field, and so I would ask that if you have questions to go ahead and start to type in your questions, and we'll be able to try to field them as we go along. So as we begin here, by way of introduction, I'd like to ask each of our panelists, can you describe the challenges related to climate you're seeing in your communities and how your organization is responding? So why don't we start with Brett?
Thank you, John. The challenges in my community, I grew up on the Navajo Nation and work with a lot of indigenous communities across the country. In the climate conversations, a lot of them are figuring, the challenge of how to reinvigorate our economies. A lot of our communities were based, largely on fossil fuel industries, coal, gas, oil, and the impacts of closure of those facilities, as well as the downturn of those markets, has really put a lot of these communities in a tough position. So, one of the things we're leading at Navajo Power in the conversation we're having is how do we, support communities, but also provide that technical, support to be able to, in a way, catch the wave of this transition in terms of developing new jobs, new sources of revenues, and getting creative around how to realize these things, whether that's capacity or resources. And that's, kind of what we created ourselves to do, is facilitate that transaction and hopefully smooth out some of the rougher edges that this transition has kind of created. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, and we'll definitely pick up, especially on what the more specifics of what you're doing relative to the opportunities that present themselves. Annie, can you say a little bit about the challenges and how your organization is meeting those challenges?
Sure. Thank you, John. And just thank you, John Moon and the Wells Fargo Foundation for funding the production of What's Possible. It's a great contribution to the field. So Raza Development Fund is a CDFI. We're a national CDFI, the largest Latino-focused CDFI. We were created by Unidos US, which is the largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization, as a CDFI that would serve the 300 affiliates of Unidos US. And the reason I start with that is because from the framing of our partner organization, Unidos US, climate change is a civil rights issue. And that's because where Latinos live because of where they live and where they work. So, according to a recent Pew study, 56% of US Hispanics live in areas that have experienced an extreme weather event within the past year. And Latinos are overrepresented in many work sectors that will be impacted by the climate going forward because they work outside. So the agriculture sector, 83% of farm workers are Latino, tourism, construction. So as global temperatures rise, outdoor workers are actually 35 times more likely to die from heat-related illnesses. And that's not 35%, that's 35x. So this is why we can frame the issue of climate change as a civil rights issue. And so what we're doing is we're mobilizing for the 300 organizations that are Unidos US affiliates. We are, first of all, taking our time to learn what it is they're up against and to figure out where the biggest vulnerabilities are, and then how we can invest in resilience, for one, but also in the economic opportunity that's coming about as a result of a clean energy transition. So we're looking at both of those. And of our 300 affiliates, 81% are located in EPA disadvantaged communities. So we're already there. We're where this transition needs to happen. We're connected to the communities that are doing the work. And now it's up to us to figure out how to get the resources to communities in the right form and fashion. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Annie. And we already have a theme of economic opportunity, which I know we're going to pick up for sure. And yeah, having visited the Southwest many times during the summer, it does not cool off at night. And so it's an extraordinary set of conditions facing especially folks working outdoors. Finally, John Smith, could you say a little bit about what's going on in your community?
Yes, thank you, John, and thank you to everyone who is on and the other two panelists I'm sharing this with. So in Boston, the most crucial decisions over the past probably 10 to 15 years have involved land uses and zoning and the investment of public and private capital in infrastructure and buildings. And if you understand the history of Boston in the 18 and 1900s, for example, Boston increased its land area by more than 5,200 acres. So it's mostly by filling in the tidal flats surrounding the city. So this practice of land making, while it wasn't, it's not unusual for cities or coastal cities, but the amount of land, they said, in Boston is probably, that was created that way, is probably more than any other city in the United States. So today, about a sixth of Boston exists on a landfill. And the impacts of climate change will not and do not fall equally on all the neighborhoods and households in Boston. Some places will be definitely more exposed due to their location and due to the effects that include flooding from sea level rise, heavy rainfall, or extreme heat. Others will be less able to bounce back from climate impacts because their access to financial and community resources is constrained. If you know the history of Boston, you know that there's, it's replete with historic racial inequities. And a wealth of the data right now that we're looking at shows that the climate vulnerabilities are really disproportionately borne by Boston communities of color. Even though that community has really not contributed far less to greenhouse gas emissions, right, that cause climate change. So we work with community, within our community, the Dorchester Roxbury community, where most of right now the Black and Brown population live. And we understand that, dealing with these inequities, they have not all, and the decisions that get made, most of them have played out from a very top-down approach to urban planning and development, which has been controlled by, mostly white and other organizations in Boston and the region. So the people who are negatively affected by these decisions have not really had their voices heard. Yeah. So what we want to do is really bring that to the front and center the table, bring the folks who are going to be directly impacted to the front and center of these conversations, which we've begun doing.
Yeah, that's terrific, John. And John, can you think of one or two examples of how you're seeing the impacts of climate in Dorchester, Roxbury?
Definitely through heat and flooding.
Okay.
So right
Okay,
right now, when it's raining, or if it snows a lot, or the snow is melting off, there are many areas that are starting to flood. And we know from the folks at the city who do environment, and also some of the utilities, that this area is the most heat impacted area in the city.
Got it. Thank you. We're going to shift it over to Annie. Annie, so Raza is representative of a broader sector, the community development sector. And how is the community development sector positioned to be a unique solution and a set of actors related to supporting disinvested low-income communities with regard to climate change?
Yeah, so John, I'm going to take that question from the perspective of a community development financial institution. And CDFIs sit at the intersection of communities and capital. And, we know that as we try to deliver capital to communities in the way that it can be absorbed, in the way that meets communities where they are to the greatest degree possible. In the essay that Zab Briggs and I did in the introduction, we used a phrase that communities and capital markets are unequal by design. And that means if we are going to disrupt and create systems change, we have to always be working. We can't just follow the flow. There's a lot of money that's going to be flowing now, that is flowing down from the federal government through, and a lot of this is going to go through CDFIs and needs to get to communities. So the role that CDFIs have played over the years is exactly that. And I think we've proven a couple things. One of the things we've proven is that the communities we invest in that are formerly disinvested communities, where there's all kinds of perception of risk, that doesn't bear out in practice, because CDFIs are lending in disinvested communities and to people who haven't had access to credit, and our credit losses are just as good as any banks. So we know that that there's more work to do there to unleash more capital, and I think we have the track record to prove it. And I think that particularly as the federal government, with resources like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, tries to put that money out into communities. The thing that CDFIs have done in other markets that have emerged that we have served is to figure out how to structure that in a way that really does meet community needs. And I think there are two things that should bind what we do, or what we should be trying to achieve and accomplish. And with these resources, I think looking at building community ownership and building community wealth.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are good litmus tests for how well we're going to be serving communities. Is, are we building ownership? Are we building wealth at the community level?
Yeah, and as we know, there's a very substantial wealth gap between communities of color, and so CDFIs are extremely well positioned. And Annie, can you just say something really quickly about the role of CDFIs in local communities and how it relates to trust and just presence in communities?
Yeah, I think because we're in the community, we're of the community. That makes a difference. And so the work that Brett is doing, the work that John is doing, they're doing it inside a context, and the work that RDF does is inside also a cultural context.
Yeah.
And for the communities that we serve and others, there's a language context as well that's really important. And so those are the things that build trust, because when we're working with our customers and our borrowers, we're there for the journey. We're not just there for the transaction. And and Brett and John can talk about this better than I can, that, we're working in communities where it's actually rational and logical that community members would distrust
Yeah.
the forces of change that are coming at them, because they have not yet been given a reason to trust those.
Yeah.
So that's those are kind of the barriers that we have to work on bringing down, so that, as John said, community voice can come to the table and be listened to, and that not only just be listened to, but that has to translate into design of programs and into design of products.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our work.
And speaking of barriers, this is a question for both John and Brett. Can you say a little bit about some of the unique barriers in your communities that make bringing climate-related solutions more challenging to your communities? So, what are the unique barriers to bring climate-related solutions into your communities? And I'll let either of you respond to that.
Go ahead, Brett.
Okay, thank you, John. I think one of ours that we just touched on was, the industries have not been, energy in particular has been traumatic in the case of indigenous communities and a lot of communities that have been marginalized across the country. So repairing that trust within the industries, as well as within the incentives. I think the value systems are very different in terms of how the transition is determined to be of value to the communities. And so things like economics, jobs, taxes, and revenues may not resonate very well with the communities that we serve, because they don't normally see benefits from those types of things. And so their incentive to change usually kind of goes back into something very personal, something that has to be kind of drawn to the front as well, because some of these communities don't understand, not that they don't understand, but they don't have a perspective of why this transition could be beneficial for them, should the right incentives be put into place. The other part is how to go through this journey with a guided with trusted guidance. That's the other part, is who to align themselves with when it comes to making decisions. What's the right information to process in order to make sure that you're taking the best available option, that you feel like the deals are fair, and to avoid what has kind of been the traumatic experience in the past, which is feeling like you were taken advantage of, that you weren't necessarily highly prioritized, or that you were badly negotiated with and your deal is lopsided to favor someone else. Those are all inherent fears that come with dealing with a lot of these communities. And we, try to err on the side of understanding and compassion when it comes to how do we repair those things. And I don't think these communities are asking for, handouts or anything, but they are asking to be seen and acknowledged as where they are, and to help start building those bridges to where we got to get to. And I think that's something we try to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly understandable in tribal communities. The issue of trust and the past history of work with various programs. Can you say a little bit more? You said something about how the transition could benefit them, or there's a question of like how the transition can Can you say? Can you expound upon that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think for a lot of our communities, it's always seen as we've been extracted from. We were resource banks for the development. The Navajo Nation, I would say, is the battery for the Southwest. Metropolises like Phoenix, Los Angeles, Las Vegas benefited from our coal resources, our productivity, and our jobs. But you don't see the wealth creation back home that should have been spurned from the access to these resources. You don't see that materialization of good public services as a result of the tax infusions and those things. I think what needs to kind of be recategorized in terms of this conversation is community benefits look a lot differently when it comes to the eyes of these folks who have kind of been almost like an abacus measuring the previous industries as how they impacted them, and holding those receipts up saying, hey, we got to fix these other things prior to us having this conversation and how we go forward. So there's some degree of like restitution that is
Mhm.
thought about in this process. But I also think the other part, for a lot of our communities, is they're at the front lines of the impacts of climate. You know, they're
Yep.
feeling the pinch and they know they need to move. But one of the fears is making that wrong move. You know, being incentivized to do something under duress is a
Mhm.
actual traumatic experience that a lot of our communities have. I always say, like, you know, there are very few communities in the United States that have treaties as a reference point for how, you know, things operate in their communities. Tribal communities are one of them. um you know, duress has been kind of something that's made decision making very hard for a lot of our communities, because a lot of the results of the federal, you know, policy that enacted was because necessity, just something needed to change. We don't feel like those changes have enacted into positive outcomes, and so trusting the newest version, the latest thing that's come from mandate, is really hard for us
Yeah.
to process in real time. And I think that's a challenge. We need to create the right incentives for these communities that it feels just and positive going forward.
Yeah, yeah, and especially with some of the programs that we've already mentioned. I mean, there's, urgency. I mean, both in terms of like the need to respond on behalf of communities, but there's also like, deadlines and timelines associated with, the funding of many of these programs. So that's a really, really helpful point. John, can you say a little bit about some of the unique barriers in your community?
Sure, I would co-sign some of what Brett says in terms of the trust, but putting capital to work in these communities have not really resulted in anything great for them. I mean, it's in many ways it's resulted in displacement. So, this whole idea of folks wanting to come into community and invest in ways that are community focused and put them at the center has not really played out for them. So I think that whole idea of people wanting to come in and study and deal it, and they're very distrustful of that, both from the academic standpoint, and government, and financial. And I think, to Brett's point, they don't really know what would be the benefits of a green transition, and they're dealing with the financial stresses of sort of day-to-day life. Boston's a very expensive city. One is the more expensive one in the country. Housing extremely expensive, and to do this transition, it's going to cost. And so they're thinking about the resources. But I would say those, housing displacement, really not understanding the benefits of green transition, and the financial stressor, and the trust issues, what's mostly at the center for folks in community.
John, can I add an example
Yeah,
to that?
please.
So we have one of our affiliates is Casa Familiar, and they are on the border in Southern California, on the border with Mexico.
Yeah, I visit them.
Yeah, and California enacted cap and trade, and cap and trade had tax revenues coming into the state, which they then reinvested in community-based work. But they invested in it based on data. And the data they had on San Ysidro showed that they didn't have any environmental quality issues. And they knew that they did because they were sitting on the border. And every day there are like 65,000 cars that sit and idle and cross the border. So they collaborated with UC San Diego, and they did a citizen science project where they started collecting air quality data themselves. And of course, the data showed that they had very high levels of black carbon because of the air pollution from vehicles. But that's a good example of, every quarter that committee meets to review data that they're collecting on their roofs about the quality of their air. And I think that's a good example of how, local communities can be activated to, own the data and start advocating, because data is power as well, to start advocating on their own behalf, and that's led to other things as well. So.
Yeah, and John made reference to it too in his opening remarks about the importance of communities advocating for themselves and having a process and a system where community voice is regarded. It's actually a perfect transition into our next question, which is, given these barriers, so you've shared, Annie, about one equity like oriented solution, and please, add any others. But for the full panel, can you talk about from an outcome standpoint, what is an equity focused outcome that you'd like to see relative to some of the challenges that you've shared from a climate standpoint?
I can kick it off. I mean, I think from us as developers, making good sound projects is an objective. Finding ways to create more equity and ownership of assets that we output for communities is definitely something we're prioritizing. And part of that is getting them, support from a capacity level to understand the financial benefits of being an investor, being an equity owner in assets such as infrastructure and clean technology. I think one of the reasons we're looking at that is the returns that come from these projects. A lot of times the focus is on leases, taxes, and those places, but the revenues from the transactions that occur in these things largely go to Wall Street and to those with the liquidity to be able to finance these things. Finding ways to divert some of those resources back into the communities where they're born out of, I think, would be a priority, because it would help us to build more capacity and financial infrastructure for these communities to not only just participate in this particular instance, but to really think more holistically about how they use economics as a driver for resourcing themselves and building the capital required to provide the services that they're trying to. I think that equity building is definitely something we're focused on.
Yeah, and I've actually been involved in a couple of projects where I've learned about some utility scale renewable energy projects that are being led by indigenous groups. And what's remarkable about them is exactly what you shared, is that they own the project. They could build assets, they could diversify their income, and they could actually distribute and make it reduce energy burden for tribal members and other partners. So it's a great example. John or Annie, what are some equity-based outcomes you'd like to see?
I think for us, it's, listening to Brett and what's happening in the community. It'd be interesting for us in, these neighborhoods to learn more about some of these programs and some of these things that are happening. So education-based. And I think for us to, we're thinking about, reduce community energy cost savings. How can we improve the local air quality, and also economic stability and job training, because this new economy, this new green economy will produce a different type of job and need a different type of training. So those are some of the things we're thinking about.
And John, I would just add from what John Smith said, and I think this is one of the brilliant things that we have all learned from the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative and the work that you've accomplished over decades in a sustainable way, is that quality of life changes. It is really matters. So people in community have to feel quality of life, advances, benefits, and John Smith, I think, we wrote in one of the articles that I worked on, we wrote about the experience of DSNI and how, you were able to do that and then keep building off of it.
And on this issue of energy burden, I think statistics bear out that low-income communities bear a greater portion of energy burden because just when you look at, lower household income levels, when you look at the lower denominator and you put the energy costs in the numerator, it becomes a bigger challenge. For anyone, I mean, can you say a little bit about like what some of the like the green projects that you're seeing, what that might mean to address energy burdens?
I mean, it's huge. I sit on the board of Groundswell Inc., which does community solar, and
Yep.
there's have very concrete goals on by how much do they want to reduce energy burden. And they just received a Solar for All
Yeah.
award as part of a consortium for the Southeast, and that will be the test, of whether we're doing this right or not, is the reduction of energy burden. And I think we know enough to know that solar energy can do that, and we have to. It's going to be harder to do it in that geographic context, but we know it can be done. And so I think that's the exciting part of the moment that we're in now, is finally there are resources flowing to help us do some of the things that actually have already been tested.
Yeah, because if you can own these renewable projects or have access to them, it reduces the volatility that some may experience with their energy bills. And it reduces that volatility, which is hugely important for low-income households. That's a great example.
I think to add on to that,
Yeah.
like one of the other things that we're hoping, this highlights is like the autonomy that being able to access resources directly creates in terms of democratizing energy by being able to take some affordable moves, putting solar on your roof, doing some cost energy efficiency type things to your home, empower you to be able to have a better quality of life. I think like those things are kind of largely being lost in this conversation, but need to be highlighted, because one of the things that we've frustrated with in tribal settings is that there's always some other controlling factor determining the quality of life, whether that's like rate setting for energy, the cost of energy, or these things that they're trying to do to mitigate these spikes in price. Because what's interesting is the wholesale price of energy is going down with PPAs. That's been evident for the last decade, but the rates being passed on to customers are rising. The cost of that energy is largely being passed on to the consumers. Those with fixed budgets and incomes already in distress are stressing more, and are usually in places where they cannot access things like rooftops or some of these community solar initiatives due to policy. Sometimes it's just the unfortunate mess of being born in a place that doesn't allow you to take advantage of some of these things. So that places we can do this, we need to expand upon and use those lessons and learnings to be able to create more access to being able to control the outcomes of a necessity such as electrification. Because by this point, a large amount of the country should have affordable solutions that are available, and maybe even available in multiple formats. But there are still, like the Navajo Nation still has a large amount of unelectrified homes. There's also a high cost of energy in a lot of these communities because they're buying power at the end of the line where it's the most expensive, and they're running infrastructure at a time when the prices for raw resources are the highest cost. And so being able to use technology to help offset some of that burden and the innovations in financial and fintech, I think you're going to help us further, expand upon the benefits that could come from the transition.
And speaking of benefits, we've talked a little bit. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Speaking of benefits, so recently the EPA announced the awards for $27 billion in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, with much of the funding intended to go into low-income communities. So can you say a little bit about what it will take to unlock those resources for the communities that you serve?
more money. It's
Well,
unfortunately.
I mean that's a good point. I mean it's a lot of money, but what can be
I,
done to ensure or to support the availability of $27 billion
Mhm.
in green lending and green funding into your communities?
I think alignment of incentives in terms of the industry, the financial sector, and the local communities finding where these magic points all intersect in terms of investing into infrastructure that is cost effective, that provides a regional benefit, and maybe create some equity. I do think like part of like the low income community challenge is the lack of resources, including time and capacity, on top of dollars. Any support from the philanthropic world, as well as the CDFI network and the other worlds that advise these places, to shorten the time frame and understanding how to make a good decision, is going to allow for projects to proceed the way that they need to. I think part of the challenge, especially with the rapidness that the guidance is coming out,
Yeah.
is we do not know fully how to enact these things on an execution basis. We know what generally they look like, but getting more clarity and technical guidance to make a good decision is still a limiting factor, because the IRS, Treasury, and others all have to weigh in on how they see this playing out. And so, as communities start planning, as professionals, we can do our best to start trying to translate that information to communities so that they absorb and get the necessary time to think about how they could utilize those opportunities.
Hmm.
And I'll just say that, so just to put a put an emphasis on some of the things that Brett has just said. Communities work at the speed of trust, and you mentioned that, John. That we need those trusted organizations at the ground level, but we have to work at the speed of trust and not at the speed of markets. And the fear with a program of like GGRF that's 27 billion, which seems like a tremendous amount of money, right? But if we have to move that all really fast, it's going to default to where money flows most easily. And we don't want to repeat, say, what happened in the PPP program during the pandemic, where a lot of money went through that system. And at first, it didn't get to communities. So we have to be careful that we're creating the channels between government and community, that we're listening to, like the folks who are on this call, about how to build that pipeline, that link between government and community, so that it flows. And I think that our government doesn't completely understand that just yet. And I think we have a lot of really great people inside government, and many who are trying to do that. And it's hard work. It's hard work to not just default to what's going to move fastest versus what's going to move best, and in a way that's going to have an equitable outcome that really reinforces: have we created community ownership? Have we built community wealth?
Yeah, and Brett alluded to some of the capacity building that's needed so that, communities and community-based organizations have sort of the technical wherewithal to present a pipeline of transactions that could be funded as part of, the overall pipeline of opportunities. John?
Yeah, John, I think that, lots of these smaller organizations that are based in community and fiscally sponsored, that kind of thing, it's really difficult for them to start to handle millions and billions of dollars. So when we say, oh, we're at this historic moment and the government and folks are spending so much money and it's all these billions of dollars, they cannot handle that. So we know of many organizations that are working on the ground, and they would love to do something and engage their communities. They don't have the back end, the training, the folks, they don't have the infrastructure to really lead that. There may be 2 or 3 people working at an organization, right? So that's one piece of it. And, they get lost, I think, sometimes is where's all this decision making coming from that will end up deciding who gets what, right? And sometimes it's not shared decision making. So that's also an issue that has to be that we have to work through. And we don't know. I don't have an answer for who are the organizational people who are going to bridge this gap, as Annie was talking about, and we're all talking about, between government, community organizations, and how things are deployed. We're deploying resources in communities and talking about building community wealth in financially distressed communities who may not understand what it means to who may not have all the resources in their communities to help build community wealth. So it's an interesting conversation that we're having, and I think we have to think about that middle, like how do we make it happen?
And if I can take Annie's earlier response about CDFIs who have the trust in communities, and so moving at the speed of trust, and they will be sort of the last mile in terms of financing through GGRF, and so it seems to me like there's also an opportunity to work closely with the community development financial institutions that may be serving your communities, and really working with them to establish this trust, build on the trust that's already established, and then for the CDFIs to have sort of the patience to really understand and hear from communities about what kinds of projects could be funded. All right, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I took a quick look at the chat. Before we go to our last question, there is one quick question for, sorry, hold on. Oh, okay. There's one for John. Looks increased non-porous gray surfaces add to both urban heat island effect and water runoff during rain, snow. Question to John Smith on how their communities are impacted and what are some of the steps they are taking. The other question that I think we might have time for is, we'll do this at the end, is folks want to be able to reach you, and so we'll share our information, contact information to the extent that you're able to. So John, do you want to take it before we do the last final question?
So what is the question for me?
About the porous surface. Is there anything that gray surfaces, porous surfaces, anything happening in Dorchester?
No, not yet. And I mean, it's a great question. Thank you so much for whoever asked it. But we have to work with vendors, different providers and folks at the city, because it's mainly a city function in terms of implementing all these different things to understand what they're actually putting in, what their plans are. So they're literally digging up the streets of Boston right now. They're changing the water mains and all that. But no, we have not heard about anything like that. But thank you for the question.
Yeah. And there are some, more natural stormwater, system retrofits that I've seen and heard, not necessarily porous, surfaces, but there are other solutions. All right. In the last 2 minutes, so we've talked about transformation. What important transformation would you like to see in 10 years in your community? And I'll have to ask you to be as succinct as possible. And before you share your transformation, if you're comfortable, if you can just share your how to get in touch with you.
So I'll start off. I'm at Donovan at razafund, razafund.org. And in 10 years, I would like to see climate resiliency and energy efficiency built into horizontally across the entire CDFI sector, so that every deal we do is a climate friendly deal.
That'd be amazing. John or Brett?
Sure. I would say develop minority and woman-owned contractors to compete in this world, and just reverse the history of environmental injustice and avoid sort of citing environmental hazards in vulnerable communities.
Thank you, John. Brett?
And for me, I think it's just seeing more indigenous, involvement and engagement and ownership of assets and participation in the contributing sectors that are going to contribute to, climate abatement. I think seeing that is going to be very important. And for those that want to get a hold of us, navajopower.com is a good place to start.
Oh, I forgot to say, for those who want to get hold of me, it's sorry about that. J Smith, really John Smith, J Smith at dsni.org.
Fantastic. And I am John.Moon at Wells Fargo. But I most of all want to thank this incredible panel and more importantly, the amazing work that they're doing to support their communities. And so thank you for joining us. And thank you especially to the panels for making time to share your perspective. We'll see you around. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you all.